Okay, welcome everybody. I'm just going to give it about 30 seconds or so to let people join and connect. See everyone logging on there, which is great. Okay, I shall start my intro then while people are beginning to join. So good afternoon everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, How to Move Away from Wagile. So 20 years on from the start of the Agile manifesto, Agile transformation remains a risky challenge for organizations. I'm joined today by two Pluralsight authors, Jarrell and Tommy van Schaik, as they break down the most prominent Agile anti-patterns within organizations. Jeremy is a product leader and an author who helps teams get better at doing what they love. And Tommy is an IT project manager and author who sees Agile as the result of a perfect storm in which products become more complex, coupled with the explosion of the internet. So Jeremy and Tommy will take us through the webinar, and there will be a chance to ask questions as we go through it and at the end. So please pop any questions that you have into the Q&A box and we will answer them. So I'm now going to hand you over to Jeremy and Tommy, and they will kick us off. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Jill. Thanks, everyone. As Jill said, my name is Jarrell, and I'm a product leader and a Pluralsight author based in the United States. When I'm not creating courses for Pluralsight, I work with early stage startups and early stage companies, helping them get their feet underneath them and get great products to market. I'm joined by Tommy van Schaik from the Netherlands. Tommy, as Jill said, is a senior IT project manager for NATO and is the author of over 40 Pluralsight courses, if you can believe that or not. Tommy, I'm thrilled to be here with you today.
Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, I'm really excited for this one. So for everyone, we have our social media details on screen. We'd love for you to connect with us. We share updates on our content and the new courses we create for Pluralsight there. This webinar is for people and organizations that are either working in Agile already and want to reach the next maturity level, or if you just started using Agile and want to avoid some of those common pitfalls. So first up, we have Jeremy, who will go through what Wagile is, and after that, we will have some questions and answers. The second part of this presentation then will be about the Wagile anti-patterns and how to break free of them. And again, we'll have a question and answer session. The whole thing will be about an hour. And once again, if you do have questions, like Jill already mentioned, please put them in the Q&A box, and we will answer them in either one of two sessions. All right, Jeremy, take it away.
Thanks, Tommy. So I'd like to start today by talking about waterfall. And waterfall is our base measurement. Now, most of us on this call are probably familiar with waterfall already. And it's not really a surprise. Waterfall, after all, has been around for, at this point in 2020, well over half a century, probably closer to the 60 to 70 year marks. Now, waterfall doesn't have the best reputation, but it can actually work well in certain situations. So for example, waterfall actually works quite well for small projects. And that's because in these small projects, there tends to be less unknown. And because there's less unknown, much less is likely to change. It's also very good for repeatable projects. These are the projects where you have a known end goal. The projects where the same inputs given the same outputs to the same process tends to create the same output. So if you have a lot less unknown going through the project, then waterfall and the defined process that comes with it actually works pretty well. And waterfall is actually good for physical projects. These are the types of projects like building a house or building a car. In these projects, the overall architecture is already defined. One car to the next, or one house to the next doesn't change its overall form or its overall structure that much. Everything kind of comes together in defined order, regardless of what kind of house you're building. You start with a foundation, you build up the frame, you finish the house, you move on to the interior. It's a well-known order, regardless of what the end goal actually looks like. And what's also interesting about both of these situations when you have physical projects is that there's less inherent malleability in the materials. So it's much harder to bend steel to an emerging need or bend wood to an emerging need after you've created it than it is to bend code. Finally, waterfall is a very well-known process, so there's very little opportunity for confusion. Like I said, in the IT and the technical space, at this point, most of us are already pretty familiar with waterfall. In fact, the software development lifecycle, which consists of gathering requirements, designing a solution, building on that solution, testing that solution, releasing it to market, and then maintaining it, is all based on the waterfall methodology. So it's a pretty familiar example at this point, a pretty familiar way of working.
So, Jeremy, do you have an example of a project where waterfall would be the best approach?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a great example of a waterfall project, especially in the IT and tech space, is enterprise app integration. So this is when you build, like, say, a B2B enterprise level app, and then you have to bring this out to your customers. I've built a lot of these in my career, and what's interesting is even though the actual app development itself could be done in a waterfall or an agile process, the actual deployment out to the individual clients and the integration tends to follow a pretty waterfall way of working. And that's because the way this process works tend to be pretty straightforward. Now it's going to vary a little bit per every app. Let's say, for example, some of the apps I've worked with in the past, whenever we bring this into a client site, we had a pretty known set of steps. We started with configuring the SSO and making sure that everyone at the client site could get into the app successfully through single sign-on. We defined an ETL process for data load so the clients could get their own data into our app where we could do our work with it. We defined our own support process. So it was a well-known process that the overall pieces did not change from piece to piece, and we had a pretty good idea of what the end goal was going to look like. Now, to be clear, that doesn't mean there weren't bumps along the way. Anyone who has ever lived through an SSO integration know they never go quite what you think they do, but those bumps are fairly minor and the overall process doesn't change. So in those kinds of cases where you have an overall well-defined process with a pretty clear picture of what the end state is going to look like, waterfall is a great choice. However, waterfall is not without its cons. So for example, waterfall starts to break down at the medium to large size projects. And that's because as projects get bigger, their increased size tends to bring increased complexity. And with this complexity, you're much more likely to have unexpected scope changes that you never saw coming. And for anyone who's lived through any decent IT or tech size project, the bigger it gets, the more opportunity the risk is in there. And waterfall is not great at tolerating risk. Waterfall isn't great for handling innovative work as well. So these are the projects where a goal is much less clear at the start. You may have an overall idea or kind of a North Star that your team is working for, but what the end of the goal looks like tends to be less well known. And because you're learning this goal and you're evolving in this goal throughout the life of the project, you tend to have to work through very, very tight iterations where you can learn from each iteration and feed that into the next. Waterfall is a very defined, very rigid structure. It just simply does not lend itself well to these very tight and rapid iterations. And while it also makes sense for physical projects like the cars and the houses that we spoke about before, because that approach is well defined and the materials tend to be inherently immalleable, it does not lend itself well to software. Or I should say it doesn't take advantage of the inherent malleability of software. As we all know, software is very malleable. It's a very malleable medium to work in. We can change code fairly easily. Waterfall just simply doesn't take advantage of that. It doesn't mean it doesn't work with it, but it doesn't play to its strengths. And finally, waterfall shouldn't surprise you, doesn't have the greatest reputation. So many organizations have been burnt by waterfall because they're very inherently skeptical of it. We mentioned this at the beginning of the webinar. Waterfall has been around for 50, 60, 70 some odd years now. So it has a lot of mileage and a lot of bruises and scratches to show for that case. For this reason, many organizations have been through their fair share of bad waterfall projects. And one of the biggest things that tend to happen is that because the development team who's working in the waterfall process has a tendency to lock scope down and push in because they're being judged by their adherence to scope and budget, they lock down scope and they push changes out to this mythical version 2 release. Any organization that's been through at least one of our projects know the odds of that version 2 ever coming to reality are quite low. So they're incentivized to push as much scope as possible into the current version because they know that version 2 is probably never going to happen. That sets both the sponsoring organization and the development team up at odds where they're in competing incentives for the development team to try to adhere to their budget and schedule, and the sponsoring organization to try to maximize the value they're getting out of that. It's just not a great situation. But Good news, there is a solution. So about 3 decades ago, teams began experimenting with much lighter weight methodologies, things like Scrum, XP, Kanban, Crystal. This is what eventually became Agile. Now, Agile was built from the ground up to embrace these unexpected changes. And for that reason, it's very, very well suited to these medium to large size projects where change is much more common. In addition, it's also very well suited for innovation. I touched on this a little bit when I talked about waterfall. Innovation projects, innovative projects tend to require very tight iterations because you have much less of an idea of what the solution looks like at the outset. You may have a fairly good understanding of the problem space, or at least we like to think we do, but the solution spaces tend to be much less well known. So you have to evolve towards that over the lifetime of the project to get there. And for that reason, Agile and its very light way of working lends itself very, very well to these tight iterations, because then the team can iterate very rapidly, which enables them to learn from each iteration as they go, and then enables them to incorporate that learning, that new information from the previous iterations into future iterations. And Agile is built from the ground up for digital projects. So unlike Waterfall, which was based in a much more material or physical space that we try to bring into software development and technology, Agile is built from the ground up for digital projects. This means that it takes advantage of projects where the underlying architecture and the actual code itself can change very, very easily during development, and it builds that in. We like to say Agile methodologies embrace change. We don't fear it, we don't live with it, we embrace it, and we're built from the ground up to take advantage of that.
So Jeremy, I know this is in a Pluralsight crowd, so most likely we have a lot of IT people in there who use Agile most of the time. But please, can you give an example of one of those projects that you've run?
Yeah, I think so. I think a great example for me, one of my favorite examples of an Agile project was I once worked with a very early stage startup that was building a chat application, so a consumer-based chat application to basically talk about sports. When we started this project, we had a very unclear idea of what the project looked like. We had a good idea of the problem space. We wanted to build some sort of an engaging chat model for the sports industry, but we didn't really know what the business model would look like, how we would make money. We didn't really know what the experience would look like, but we knew we had to get started. As we worked through the project, as we iterated over and over again through customer discovery, through solution discovery, through the actual product itself, a lot of things changed. The user experience changed along the way. For example, we went from a one-to-one chat model to a group-based chat model. We went actually from a full-on free-form chat model to a trivia-based model. And as a result, the whole underlying business model changed. We actually pivoted from a B2C business model to a B2B product, where we could actually start selling these at the enterprise level into very, very large venues or large restaurants, things like that. So this product changed dramatically from the outset. Agile led itself very, very well because it let us define a rough outcome. We knew roughly where we wanted to end up, but we had no idea how we wanted to get there. And if we had tried to define the entire project from the outset based on where we thought we were going to be, it would have been a disaster. So Agile lent itself very well in that solution. But I want to look at both sides of the coin. So to be fair, Agile itself is not without its own share of reputation problems. One of the things people struggle with is often Agile projects have no clear end date, or sometimes an unclear goal. Now, to be clear, that's not something that's necessitated by any specific Agile problem or Agile framework or methodology. That's just something that tends to accompany a lot of them because it's set up to be very open-ended. But if you're a sponsor, you're investing significant money into this project, this lack of clarity around what you're going to get and when you're going to get it can admittedly make you pretty nervous. It also requires much less discipline, and that's because less of the management of the team is built into the framework. So much of the onus of the team of how they direct and manage themselves day to day towards their goal is put onto the team. It also requires much more interaction with the business sponsors, which can be seen as intrusive in some cases. But that's because Agile tends to drive a lot of learning. So as new information emerges rapidly, new opportunities arrive, and you need access to the business to understand their goals so you can best capitalize on this. So this may not be a good option if you have a very disengaged sponsorship team or a very disengaged business team that simply likes to drop in and check on the team every 6 weeks, see how things are going, and then go on their way. And it also requires much more interaction with the team, which can be seen as overhead in some cases. Now, what form this takes depends on the specific Agile framework that you've chosen to use. Sometimes it's more face-to-face interaction. Sometimes it's a different form of documentation, but it's something that often catches teams off guard because sometimes it can be viewed at odds with this lightweight perception that we often have as Agile. But I would argue that almost all of these can be seen as positives. Discipline drives the team's focus. Interaction with the business sponsor builds empathy, and it also creates a lot of value with the team to drive them together. But if Agile and Waterfall both have their own pros and cons, then why can't we combine them together? And this is the perception we often see in the market. Often someone will have this idea that, hey, why don't we combine these together and create a hybrid methodology, which we call Wagile? And the reasons seem sound on the surface. If Waterfall is good for small projects, and Agile is good for larger projects, why don't we get the best of both worlds, right? Because we don't force change on people and we don't disrupt their way of working. So you're going to get less backlash and in theory, drive better adoption. In actuality, that doesn't tend to work. And as much as we think we have the best of both worlds and less disruption to the team, we often end up with the worst of both worlds. Wagile tends to be much more intrusive on the business because you're now driving disruption from both sides. It also encourages a lot of scope creep, and it also creates much never-ending projects because now everyone is hesitant to lock down scope. It's also very confusing because Agile and Waterfall conflict in many ways. They're two very different methodologies. So which path should you choose as a practitioner? This becomes much more complicated when you have different roles in your organization, some who are adherents to Agile, some who are adherents to Waterfall, and you're trying to serve both masters. The team is caught in the middle and no one wins. It also perpetuates this poor reputation that frankly follows both types of methodologies around. So no Agile projects ever succeed. So in the end, both Agile and Waterfall tend to look bad. In fact, many failed projects, whether they be Agile or Waterfall, are actually Wagile projects. And finally, it comes at higher overhead, what we call overhead plus plus. Remember what I talked about the roles and trying to serve both masters. When you have people in your organization who are adhering to Waterfall, people who are adhering to Agile, and you're trying to blend both of these conflicting frameworks together, you end up duplicating meetings, you end up duplicating reportings because you might have a Waterfall role that you're reporting to, an Agile role that you're reporting to, and you're simply trying to keep everyone happy, and you will drown your team in overhead. So this chart that we have here actually represents a very common misconception that Wagile is the best of both worlds. Wagile does not happen. This does not actually happen in the real world. So this is what we say when we say Wagile is the worst.
All right, thank you, Jeremy. This is the first Q&A part. So we got a couple of questions. The first question we got from the audience is, do we get the presentation afterwards? As a matter of fact, I think the entire session is recorded, and I think you will also receive the slides of this presentation. So yes, that's definitely true. Can also switch to the second question. This is a question he got like, hello, how should we handle a digital project which has two different teams, development and testing, and working on Agile and Waterfall at the same time? Should we suggest Wagile in such scenario? I wouldn't necessarily recommend using Wagile in that way. If you have to choose between a Waterfall and Agile method because one team uses one methodology and the other team uses the other methodology, I would definitely take the Agile approach with your team and try to work out informally any working agreements with the other team. In the next couple of slides, we will go into detail about how to handle that. But if you have the choice, I would look at an Agile way of working and having the other team, the Waterfall team, work as much as possible with you on that.
We also just had another great question from Gary about what's been our experience with project managers who are used to Waterfall, but then had to switch to an Agile approach. So my opinion, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well, Tommy, is that it may not always be the smoothest transition, but it absolutely can be done. The best advice, because I actually have this question come up fairly frequently with people I work with, the best advice that I would give you is that there are absolutely places for you in an Agile approach if you're a traditional project manager. The idea is think about where you're at. So it depends on the methodology that you're using, so the specific Agile methodology, and then what the roles are available. So most of the companies that I work with use Scrum. And often the question comes up, if I'm a classic project manager, where do I fit in the Scrum process? So the two obvious choices are Scrum Master or Product Owner. The question I would pose to you is that if you're a project manager who really prefers to work hands-on with your team and really kind of drive your team and work in the trenches with your team, you might want to look at the Scrum Master role. If you're a project manager who tends to focus on the overall strategy and the business value that your team is driving, Product Owner might be a great choice for you. But to your question, Gary, it absolutely can be done. And I've worked with very many talented project managers who have become very successful and talented agile practitioners as well.
Yeah, I do agree, Jeremy. It's the transition can be hard because you do have to give away some of that responsibility to the team, and that's where we, with regards to approach to a project, there's usually a disconnect. But once you start working with these agile methodologies and they seem to be working and the process takes over, usually, yeah, the project manager can be a valuable asset to the team. So I totally agree. Okay, we've got a second question from James. There is a perception that agile is multiple sprints of waterfalls. What do you think from this perspective? Yeah, I can imagine that from someone who's new to the whole concept of agile, this can be the way that it is viewed. But there are processes in agile, obviously, that really do away with this agile. And I think the most prominent one is that you don't have a big design up front in your projects usually. So yeah, it can look like multiple waterfall iterations, let's say. But there are definitely other aspects also important. So if you want to use an agile methodology, you want to switch to one, my advice would be to just take an agile methodology that is best suited for your particular projects. Let's say it's Scrum or maybe it's Kanban, and just use it out of the box. And then you'll see that there are a lot of different aspects to agile, which will definitely shy away from multiple waterfall iterations. What's your opinion on that, Jeremy?
Yeah, absolutely agree. I think that's a great choice, Tommy. I think we do see quite common in the agile world where you tend to bend a framework to your needs or tend to eventually take a much more pragmatic approach. But I absolutely agree with starting to use it out of the box and see what works and see what feels right for your organization. The other thing I would add about using things out of the box as well, and not being wary of bending things too much to your will at the beginning, is that many of these agile frameworks are designed to highlight problems in your organization. And oftentimes, whenever you say, let's start using Scrum, and something in Scrum feels like it's not a fit for your organization, to take a pause before saying, oh, well, our organization doesn't work like this, we're just going to bend this to make this work like this, to look at it out of the box and say, well, does something hurt here, or does something not work right because it's exposing an opportunity for us to grow as an organization? I think that's many of these are designed to shine a light. So I think that's a great point. But another question, great question from Vidor. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name. I love the question. It's basically how to avoid being agile and name only. So we seem to have all the terms and roles such as Scrum Masters, PO, Squads, Tribes, Tech, but the tech and finance still seem to be stuck in the old way of thinking and style. The best advice I would give you is to really really look internally, really reflect and say, when you're operating in Agile, whether it's a continuous flow like Kanban or a cadence approach like Scrum, are you being iterative, and are you working in increments and iterations? So oftentimes, like when we look at Agile to be successful, it has to be incremental and iterative. Many companies or many teams stop at the incremental part, especially if they're using Scrum. And incremental encourages you to really just kind of break a very, very large project down into small chunks. There was another comment I saw about Agile kind of working in mini waterfall sprints. That perception definitely happens, or that issue can happen. So the idea is kind of really, incremental projects encourage you to break what might be a 12-month project down into 24 sprints, for example, if you're working in a 2-week sprint. Many companies stop there. But to really gain the value of Agile, each of those sprints, each of those increments have to be iterative, which means that you are taking a very honest and candid approach to, let's learn what did not go well in the last sprint, both internally as a team, but also when we release that product to market, release that product to our customers. What did they like? What did they not like? And feed that learning back into the next iteration. We're inspecting and adapting. The problem, so that is how you actually get better as a team, and that's how you really start to unlock the value of Agile. Otherwise, if you're just breaking the project down into small increments without any iteration, you're simply just going to deliver the wrong project faster. The goal was to learn from each increment and to fold that in. I think that's when you start to really unlock the true value of Agile. And unfortunately, that's what a lot of companies miss.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, I do like that question. Sorry about that. I do like that question though, because indeed, the part that I like is that the finance and leadership seems to be stuck in the old way, while usually the IT department and the different teams actually do have an agile way of working and seem to be, pretty proficient at that. But once you have the other departments that are not moving in an agile way, that's usually where organization gets stuck. So like Jeremy said, if you move to a higher maturity level, usually you see these type of organizations also transitioning to a more iterative approach. So yeah, that's definitely a good question. Let's see. It's got so many great questions here. Thanks.
We do, yeah.
Yeah. All right, this might be a good practical one. What do you think about people trying to be a Scrum Master and a product owner at the same time? I don't see it happen that often because I don't think it necessarily works, because there's a debate whether or not the product owner should be part of the team, right? Or should be part of the customer organization. I think it can be hard to take on both roles because one of them is focused purely on the product owner, obviously. And the other one is more about the process and making sure that things are smoothed out. Usually this can also be a developer who is part of the development team itself. So yeah, I think sharing those responsibilities can be hard. What's your opinion about that, Jeremy?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's very challenging. I think one of the things we should keep in mind is that product owner is often intended to be a full-time role. It can be very time intensive and very demanding. Scrum Master, it's very common for someone to be an individual contributor, such as like a developer, a designer, or a tester, and also be serve the Scrum Master role for their team. I think there are actually situations where that approach is excellent because they're really embedded in the trenches and have much more empathy for the team is going through. But product owner, it's tough to play that role along with something else. So it can be very challenging. I would also add too that when you look at Scrum is really designed to separate those roles because in the Scrum framework, those roles have competing incentives. So they're set up to be a very healthy tension. I think of them as the yin and the yang of the Scrum team, essentially. So they're designed to, they both have incentives. The Scrum Master has, essentially the incentives to create a sustainable environment for the team. The product owner has this incentive to set, to deliver value for the sponsoring or the sponsoring organization. So there can be competing incentives there. That's a very healthy tension that you're trying to create. And when you combine those roles, that tension tends to go away because someone, no matter how equal we try to play the cards, that someone always has a bias to one way or the other. So you lose that tension. I would say it can be done, but I would ask you to realize that when you do that, and we're talking about, Scrum Masters and product owners, we're talking about the Scrum framework, you're stepping away from the Scrum framework then. So understand that a lot of other things in the Scrum framework aren't really going to work as well as they would, as they would in other cases. So things eventually start to break down and things that you just don't get the value from it. But there are absolutely cases where you can do it. So the example I always point to, the Toyota production system, the TPS, which is actually a lot of the methodology, a lot of the ideas that Scrum is based on. It actually has this role of essentially, I think it's a chief engineer is what they call it, and it's essentially someone who basically plays, for all intents and purposes, a Scrum Master in the product owner role. So it's so there is kind of this process. There is precedent out there. Traditional product managers look like Microsoft has a concept of a program manager, a technical program manager that kind of fills this role as well. So there are cases you can do it, but they're not using Scrum as we think of Scrum. So just understand that if you were in a position where you need to combine those roles, all the caveats that Tommy said, I think were great. That's something you need to keep in mind. And I would also push you to say, you should question if Scrum is the right framework for you, or is there another Agile framework that might be a better fit for your organization? There's an yep. Go ahead, Tommy.
Well, I think we have time for one more. So if you want to take
Okay.
the next one.
Yeah, I think there's one more I want to hit. Linus, I believe you asked. There's perception that Agile is a multiple. I'm sorry, you handle this one, Tommy. Christopher Frost, I want to hit yours. You said, could you see an approach where an overall program of work is broken down into some Agile delivery and some waterfall delivery? So in this case, Agile will be used for the parts where the scope or the outcomes are dynamic or less well defined, and waterfall will be used for the outcomes or the scope is well understood and stable. Absolutely. I mean, I think that as much as we just beat up on Wagile. And the concept of saying like, hey, you can't combine Scrum or you can't combine Agile and Waterfall together. I think there absolutely are cases in an extremely large program where you would run some of that program in an Agile way and some of that program in a Waterfall way. I think what I would clarify when I think about that is that in those cases, it's a there are parts of the program or components of the program that are ran in a very clear Agile approach, and separate discrete parts over here that are ran in a very clear waterfall approach. So you're not necessarily blending the methodologies. And I would also argue that you're not switching in between. It's not a concept where like, hey, we're going to start the project out in Agile and run that for 6 months. And then once we understand it, we're going to switch to waterfall. Like, you're not switching the project over a timeline. There might be parts that are well-defined. And I came back to enterprise software as an example earlier. I think that's a good example where the product development and the actual product facing work can be done in an Agile approach, but the actual deployment cycles, the integration cycles, the implementation that we often see accompany enterprise software is often done in waterfall. So that's a great example where you have an overarching program that owns both aspects of that product and getting that product to market. But in some cases, Agile is a very good fit. In other cases, waterfall is a very good fit. I would just challenge you to be very intentional about what parts of the program will be run in Agile and what parts will be run in waterfall, and make sure you communicate that out to everyone and why that decision is made. Because it's all about increasing clarity and removing unknown and ambiguity from your team. You don't want there to be any question, which is what we run into with Wagile. You don't want there to be any question of like, hey, are we an Agile team or are we a waterfall team? Just be explicit. I think that you'll be fine. Tommy, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think in all honesty, with these larger programs, you cannot really avoid doing both methodologies. Usually there's an acquisition component involved, which usually has longer timelines. Not all of it might be a digital product. There might be some physical aspects involved, which require more architecture up front. So yeah, I think in these larger products, I do have an example in the next couple of slides, indeed. There's no way to avoid it, in my opinion. So yeah, you need to find the right combination. But as Jeremy just mentioned, I think it's important that you create clarity on what part will be done and what way of working. I think that's key to making it work in these large programs. So yeah. All right, thank you guys for the questions. I think we will have more than enough time after the second part of the presentation to go ahead and answer any that we didn't answer yet. But keep submitting, please. All right. So let's see the next part. Jeremy, you want to take it?
Sure. Let's move on to the second half of this webinar. In this half, Tommy's going to review 3 Wagile anti-patterns and then provide 3 fixes for each anti-pattern. But I would also echo what Tommy said. Remember, keep submitting your questions. We're going to have a second round of Q&A at the end of this session, so we definitely want to come back and make sure that we address all the thoughts that everyone's adding. It's all yours, Tommy.
All right, thanks a lot. So first of all, we do have an article on Wagile and the anti-patterns, and especially how to break away from them. You can see the URL in the screen. So if you want any more details about what we're going to talk about here in the next couple of slides, feel free to go to this site and you can download it. And if you want more detail, might be beneficial. So we talked about Wagile and that organizations sometimes find themselves in a Wagile state. We identified a couple of anti-patterns that can clearly tell whether or not you find yourself in a position you don't necessarily want to be in. So we'll provide the anti-pattern and then we'll provide a couple of examples on how to move away from that. So the first anti-pattern that we usually notice is that we seem to be the only Agile team. So let's say you have a team, usually a team of developers, and you're working in an Agile way. So you're either using Scrum or Kanban, And the process on the team level is usually pretty smooth out, let's say. So it's working effectively. But the other organizations around you, like finance, the project management organization, or other teams even, are not using Agile. They're using a waterfall way of working. A couple of clear tells in this type of situation is usually that management still wants the single project manager to be in charge of your team instead of making the entire team accountable. We also typically see that the team itself, the Agile team, delivers in these small incremental boxes, but then when they deliver, it's these huge delivery cycles, like half a year, usually a year before some release gets pushed to the customer. So the team might be incremental, but you're still stuck to these large releases because the other teams are not working in that way. And the last typical tell is that you don't have any direct interaction with the customer. So you might still be stuck with a big design up front, which you might execute on incrementally. But because of the environment, it's not possible to start up with a minimal design up front. So these are typical tells that we have. Now, the good thing is there are a couple of ways to go around this. And the first one is to basically show that it's working. You want to be the change that you'd like to see in the organization. And the best way to do this, in our opinion, is to set up good metrics. Make sure that you have good metrics for the organization that they find valuable. And then just celebrate and broadcast once you hit those metrics. You can do this through newsletters, management briefings, communities of interest, whatever you have in your organization to share information. But the key is, if you're successful, be as visible as possible. And a good tip there that I got from Jeremy is, if you have a management sponsor that is supporting your way of working, make sure to definitely use that to voice out the successes of your Agile team. If you do this, you will notice that it will spread throughout the other teams, and you can spread the Agile philosophy in that way. The second thing is to expand informally. And this relates to the question of Christopher, I think it was. What do you do when there are people or teams around you that are not working in an Agile way? And I think the best way to do that is to make informal agreements with them and try to get them to be as agile as possible. So for instance, if you do have a finance department, maybe you can share with them, okay, is there a financial structure we can figure out that's not as rigid as we usually have? Or maybe the acquisition department has framework contracts in place that you can use to be more flexible with your contractors. So these are the types of examples which you can make informal agreements with other parts of the organization that fits your way of working best. And another one that tends to work is just to scale up the team. So if you're doing well, you're working in an Agile way, take on bigger parts of the product or take on more products. And if your team grows beyond a certain size, you might want to move to a scaled Agile approach or a Scrum of Scrum approach. So just keep building the team, and if the team then has an Agile way of working, you can expand it in that way. So these are three typical ways that you can move away from the fact that you seem to be the only Agile team in the organization.
Thanks, Tommy. Can you provide an example of where you've seen this occur?
Yes, definitely. Where we saw this a lot was, let's see. Yeah, when I worked in the aviation industry, we had a team that did the aviation software. Now, obviously, this was a digital product, so there was a lot of flexibility there. We could use an Agile approach to present the product. But the rest of the aircraft, obviously, were physical components, and especially in the aviation industry, is heavily regulated. So you need a lot of design up front. You need a lot of approval before you can even start production. So this is where we made agreements, and we basically used, I think, the first two examples here. So we showed them it was working, and we expanded informally. So we made a lot of agreements with other parts of the technical organization, but also with acquisition. And eventually we figured out that, I guess, 9 months to a year, you see the other parts of the organization also moving in this Agile way of working, because you can show them it's working. So yeah, definitely there are good examples of, especially when physical and digital projects meet. That's where you see this a lot.
Awesome, thank you.
Okay, so let's move to the second anti-pattern. This is where you feel that the process is stuck. We see this a lot in teams. Typical tells are your stand-ups are turned into progress meetings. People just tell them, okay, I've been doing this, I'm going to start this, and we are 50% of the way. But there's not much innovation or refreshment going on there. if you do have issues that you identified in previous stand-ups or retrospectives, these issues are not addressed. That's also a typical tell. And one that we see a lot is that if retrospectives only focus on the product itself that you're creating, but not look at the process, the team process that you have, try to improve that, or the team member's situation if you try to improve that, then it's also a typical tell that your process might be stuck. But there's a way out of that also. The first question you might want to ask yourself is, how much agile do you actually need? Like Jeremy presented in the first part of the presentation, it's not always the case that you need to be as agile as possible. The product, but also the organization, the team, they all determine what level of agile do you actually need. There are great frameworks out there that can tailor the agile to the individual situation. But a good example that we usually have is that teams might not feel comfortable reviewing their peers within the team. So it might be that they don't necessarily feel comfortable with reviewing other people's work. And that might, well, then an agile process might not be the best way to go. So you might want to ask yourself, how much agile do you actually need? Or is it better to apply a waterfall way of working? The second thing you want to look at, if you see the process is stuck, usually one of the tells that we see is that teams only focus on the product that they're trying to create, but they forget about the people and the process in the organization. So when you have a team that is working in an agile way, you should also try and improve the people's stance within the organization, see how they're doing, if they see things that can be improved upon in the environment, and the process itself. Do we need longer retrospectives? Do we need to involve other people in these meetings that we have? And you should keep evaluating the process. And the last thing is that you should make things actionable. So we usually have quality items like velocity, customer satisfaction. When you do have metrics in place, you need to make sure that there's an action owner assigned and that you do keep track of these things and improve them over time. So that's definitely a tip that you should take. Make an action owner out of each thing that comes out of your retrospectives.
So Tommy, you touched on metrics a little bit there. In your experience working with teams, have you ever seen teams get overly attached to certain metrics like velocity?
Velocity is actually a great example, yes. It's not necessarily the teams that get stuck on that, but it's management in the organization that tends to look at one metric when they implement Agile, and then they keep looking at that metric. And velocity is actually a great example. It's great to see the progress of the team over time, but then management starts to use velocity to measure between different teams who's doing better, and that's not what it was designed for. So I think the best approach there is to also make your metrics part of your retrospective and see whether or not the metrics that you have in place are actually valuable. For instance, if you use bugs per 1,000 lines of code, for instance, is that a fair metric to use for a team that is using a legacy software? Probably not, because it's more buggy by nature. So yeah, you have to be really careful about those metrics and make them part of the Agile process, I think. All right, thanks for that question, Jeremy. Let's see, the last anti-pattern that we want to cover is, and this is probably pretty visual within most organizations, is that management simply isn't on board. As you can imagine, executive management in an organization might have 1,000 things on their mind, and the implementation of Agile might not necessarily be on the top of their priority list. Now, granted, it has been around for quite some time now, and I think more of management seems to grasp that it's needed for survival, especially in digital type of environments. But still, we still see a lot of organizations where the Agile implementation or the way of moving to an Agile organization is really not on the agenda. But there's still a couple of things that you can do there. First one, you want to go straight to the sponsors. So as Jeremy also mentioned earlier, the sponsors' engagement within the Agile process is vital for the success of Agile. However, that also works the other way around. So let's say that you are moving towards a customer and start to engaging with them more than you usually did in a waterfall way of working. Once you get that engagement, you can easily turn that around into an Agile way of working. The sponsors are usually, the business usually serves the sponsor. So there's a quite a possible way to, let's say, go around management and just work directly with the customer. If that happens, you have more, let's say, a stronger case to present to management that this way of working is actually good for the organization. Let's see, the second thing is get help. For some reason, I don't know why, when you should get an external consultant to help you with explaining to management that it's beneficial to work in an agile way, that seems to work better. I don't know exactly why that is, but since that is the case, hiring external contractors to provide advice to management on what way and how to implement agile seems to be working. So yeah, just get help. That's external help. That's one of the ways to go. And the last one that I want to touch on is keep educating and raising awareness. So in reality, when you provide the benefits of your agile implementation in a constructive way and educate management about those modern ways of working, then you will definitely share the agile philosophy and get more success in the organization. So this once again comes down to getting right metrics, making sure that you hit those targets, and then just celebrate your victories through all communication means necessary in the organization. So keep educating management. That's basically the advice there. All right, so that was it for the for things you can do if management is not necessarily on board with your agile approach. And that's also the end of the presentation part. I'm gonna do a small recap. Jeremy?
Thanks, Tommy. That was great. Struggling with muting. Thanks, Tommy. That was great. Let's do a recap. So we started out by explaining what Wagile is. Now, why most people think that it actually gives you the best of both worlds between waterfall and agile, it's actually an illusion that in almost all cases tend to provide the worst of both worlds, because you set up so many competing, conflicting ideas within your organization. We also talked about an agile transition, and then Tommy reviewed 3 Wagile anti-patterns and then provided 3 fixes of those for each. So before we sign off, we do want to come back to this idea of opening up for another round of questions. There's been a lot of great questions that have come in since through Tommy's talk. So let's go ahead and get started and make sure we have a chance to hit as many of these as possible. There's one that come in I'd like to start with. So someone asked, sometimes at the end of a project, if all desires are not met, the product owner can claim that the process failed and that there's no more budget. Is there the only way to prevent this waterfall requirements sign off? And if so, how do you get agreement and requirements agile to mitigate this? There's actually a lot of good stuff here that I'd like to really kind of unpack and kind of get into this. So first thing I would say is that so the idea of waterfall requirements sign off, preventing this is where we come back to this idea of waterfall works very, very well for projects where there is much more is known and there's a lot of known scope. There's much less unknown that's likely to emerge in those projects. In those cases, it's very easy to get requirements sign off at the end of the project, because everyone on day one is usually in fairly good agreement of what that's going to look like and what the end state is going to look like. In these projects where much of your learning emerges throughout the course of the project, so no one really knows what the end state is going to look like 6, 9, or 12 months down the road, the waterfall requirements sign off tends to break down very quickly. And that's where we get in these cases where I alluded to where a team is beholden to a predefined scope, budget, and schedule. But as the organization is learning, as the organization is seeing what's happening in the market around them, they're trying to introduce changes in, and that creates a competing incentive of the team. So when we fast forward to Agile, how do we create this in Agile? What is the Agile equivalent to this? So once again, it depends on the specific methodology that you're using. But if we take Scrum, for example, the whole concept of a sprint review in Scrum is designed to address this very question. And the idea is that instead of having a sign off at the beginning, and I'm not saying you don't have that in Agile, I would always start with an Agile project with a kickoff where we build rough alignment on what we're trying to achieve. But throughout the course of the project, every week, every 2 weeks, no matter, depending on how quickly you're iterating, you're having a sprint review. You're having some sort of review where the team and the product owner are sitting down with the stakeholders and saying, here's what we've done. Are we on track? Is this what you have in mind? Does this still meet your needs? Because it's not even a question of, is this what you expected? Is, hey, is this what you expected? And is this still the right choice for your business, depending on what you've learned, what you've seen in the market in the last couple of weeks? So there's these small incremental checkpoints throughout the entire project that replaces this big upfront sign off that still allows sponsors to be able to come back and say, yes, you're on track, or yes, you're not. But it gives you the opportunity to roll that learning that's happened since the project kicked off right into the framework. So that's that's kind of the equivalent in an agile project. And that's one of the reasons why we do agile, because it allows you to roll that learning in throughout the course of the project instead of building it all in the beginning and essentially making one big bet. Tom, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I agree. I do think it's part of inherently mixing the two, but like you said, there are ways you can mitigate it as much as possible, let's say. I got another great question here from Jens, actually. Should testing, in your opinion, rather be part of the sprint, or does it happen after the sprint? That's actually a great question. Yes, it should be part of the sprint, in my opinion, if possible. If you have a definition of done within your Scrum team, you should make testing part of that. However, in most organizations, testing is a scarce skill set. So if you do have dedicated testers, for some reason, it seems to work well that people have dedicated testing capabilities and keep it just for testing. If it is a scarce capacity within your organization, you might want to split those testers between different teams. Now, there are two schools of thought on that. Some people say no, testers should be part of the agile team and just one single tester per team. And other school of thought is, okay, you can split people between different teams, especially when it's a scarce resource. In my opinion, you should just take the most practical approach. But I do think that you should make testing part of the sprint itself and not do it afterwards, because that is a good way of just going back to a waterfall way of working. So I would definitely put that in the sprint. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that one, Jeremy.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the themes, or one of the values in Agile that we have to remember is that when you're working, and we're hitting a lot on sprints, but when you're working in some sort of a cadence approach like Scrum, the team must be delivering value every single iteration, and it must be delivering complete value. One of the things that we try to do in Agile, in any Agile approach, is we strive to create transparency. So we've all been in those meetings with our bosses or with our stakeholders where we've shown something on the screen and your stakeholders say, hey, this is great. And you're like, it's like, yeah, we just finished this. It's done. They're like, okay, well, let's deploy it. It's like, well, we haven't tested this and it's not in our production environment and we don't have a deployment story around this yet. So we don't even know how we would get it out there. So it's this idea that you're not really being honest and you're not being transparent with your stakeholders of what done actually means. That's another reason why we want to make sure that testing happens in the bounds of every sprint, because then you can actually stand up with confidence and say to your stakeholders, this is done because we've tested it. This is ready to go, and then you can actually have a discussion of whether or not now is the time to release it. One of the best engineers I've ever worked with likes to say that releasing should be a business decision. It should never be a technical decision. And the idea behind that is that there should never be any technical constraint that decides whether or not that you can release a product. Once you've gotten the decision it's time to release it, you should never be able to say, yes, this is the time. And then someone in the back raises their hand and says, well, we don't actually have this in our build pipeline, or we haven't tested this completely yet. We don't have automated tests around this yet. Like, that should never enter into the equation. You should be able to be transparent with your stakeholders. And when you stand up for them to say, hey, this is done, you should be able to assume that all of that is put to bed, all that is taken care of. So the only factors coming into that decision is this the right time for us as a business to bring this to market? There's another question I want to hit that's kind of near and dear to my heart. So if there is how do you move people away from a fixed price contract view of delivery? So in this case, your estimate is seen as a quote that you should deliver any user stories that come up. So I'm going to say actually something a little controversial here. Fixed price contracts are actually my favorite way to deliver agile projects. And the reason that I like the fixed price model so much in an agile way is because it creates constraints. It aligns the constraints and aligns the incentives with both the development team and the customer. So that may be a little surprising, but here's how I think about it. I like a fixed price contract because as the customer, you can look at it and say, here is the ceiling of my spend. I know how much that I'm investing in this, and this is how much my outlay is going to be. However, it's your responsibility of the Agile team to shift that conversation though away from features into time, and to help them understand, especially in a services or a consulting organization, that they're paying for your team's time and that you're going to learn and deliver features alongside them. So, that can be, I'm not saying that can't be a challenge or a hurdle in some cases, but it absolutely can be done. I used to work with a company that we basically launched startups. That's what we did, and we worked with a lot of very early stage companies and early stage clients. And every contract that we did was fixed price. It was a very agile leaning company. They had a very mature agile process. Everything we did was fixed price. But the way that we would run those projects is that we would come in at the very beginning, we would have essentially a kickoff, and we would have a vision. There was a lot of product discovery, to be fair, that would go into a lot of this. But we would have a discussion and say, hey, here is the goal that we're trying to achieve in the market that we're trying to get in. Here's what we roughly think the solution looks like. And here are some candidate features that we think are going, that might on day one be a good fit to help us meet that solution. And that's essentially how we would build the contract. But we didn't specify specific features in the contract. We didn't specify, details of like, hey, here's what the requirements would look like. We basically specified, here's what the goal is that we're trying to achieve in the marketplace. And then as that company learned, as that company evolved, and throughout the course of that, 4 to 6 to 9 month contract, we were able to build that learning in, and we were able to have a very, very reasonable discussion of, hey, we originally thought that feature X was going to be critical for this company, but now that we look at this and we've learned more about who your customers are, we see that it's not. And actually feature Y is a much better fit. So we can swap that out. So the idea is that you're building in that learning, and you're, at the end of the day, you're delivering a product that's a better fit for the market, has a higher possibility or higher likelihood of achieving product market fit. But the client or the sponsoring organization is still limiting their risk as well, because they're still working with this fixed price project, which they can always extend later if they see more opportunities. But they're never hit with this bill of the end of like, hey, I thought this was going to be a $1 million project, and suddenly this is a $2 million project. This is a $3 million project. This is always a $1 million project. But the key is that they're right there along with you, lockstep along the way, making those decisions with you of, okay, now based on what we've learned, we think that this is the best spend of our money, not that. Colin, do you have any thoughts there?
I agree. So yeah, basically, if you look at the iron triangle, like they like to call it, so you have the budget, the time, and the quality that you're delivering. Basically, in Agile, the time and the money is set, right? If you, like you said, you have a fixed price project, so it's $1 million or €1 million, and it's going to be 8 months of our development time, let's say. Fine. Then the only thing you can negotiate about is the scope itself. So if you involve the customer, like you said, and they are in the day-to-day, what features should be prioritized now? That's the best way to success. So I don't think indeed that having a fixed price project is definitely a bad thing. You just have to tell them that it's level of effort instead of actual requirements that you're delivering. Okay, I've got one from Jim. Expand informally. Realistically, the negotiation with other teams and functions is only going to succeed if there is something in it for them. Otherwise, why would they move out of their comfort zone? Yeah, I might. Okay, this is actually, I'm not going to give you a very satisfying answer, but yes, it's true. There has to be something in it for the other organizations to shift away from this. This comes back to, I guess, celebrating your successes. If it is good for the technical organization to move in an agile way, and you can persuade other functions, let's say, for instance, acquisition or finance, which are typical examples. If you engage with them and they are willing to work with you and you celebrate the success with them, it will shine off tremendously on them. So I would definitely recommend celebrating your successes with them, and maybe even get management cover for some sort of experimental way of doing this, so that their risk is covered, let's say. So you might want to take away something there. But yeah, definitely there has to be something in it for them. And that obviously depends on the organization, the people in it, and the processes that are currently in place. But yeah, I do agree that there has to be something in it for the other organization as well. Because IT, most of the time in most organizations, it's still IT that serves the rest of the business. While we tend to think that these large organizations like Amazon, and that's not the case, but in most organizations, unfortunately, it still is. So if you're seen as a supportive organization, it might be a bit more difficult to do. But yeah, I would definitely look at trying to celebrate successes and get management cover in that type of situation. I don't know if you ran into that, Jeremy, but that's my experience.
Oh yeah, I definitely run into that a lot, and I think your point's excellent. Like really celebrating the successes and being able to point back to specific examples and say, hey, here's what we did because of Agile, and and here's what it means to us. I think I would also add, when you're doing that, to also think about, like, when you're celebrating those successes and those wins, to framing them in a way that makes sense for like, let's say, the business side of the organization. And to Tommy, you touched on this a lot in your part of the session. I thought was great, is really kind of framing these wins for the business in a way that makes sense to them. So in their language and their, in their goals. So, what we often forget, from the tech side or the IT side is that when you're a business leader, when you're a CEO or a COO or CFO, Agile is just a tool to you. It's a product development strategy or a delivery strategy, but it's really no different than like choosing a sales strategy, choosing a marketing strategy, or a distribution strategy. It's one of many strategies that you're looking at deploying in your organization. And the way you're going to make that decision is in the context of, here are the goals, here are the objectives that we need to achieve as a company to still be here in 12 months. And which of these strategies do we think will best enable us to achieve those goals? So when you're thinking about how do you sell Agile upwards, I think, and you're celebrating those wins, is to be able to frame them in a way of, hey, I understand what our objectives are as a company, and I understand what we're trying to achieve, and here's how Agile has enabled us to achieve that. You don't even necessarily have to bash another methodology, just say, hey, here's what Agile enabled us to do. And then really start to kind of draw that, we're trying to map that line to draw that connection between, here's what we need to do, and here's the strategy that we think best enables us to do so.
Okay, guys, that's been great. I don't know if you want to take maybe one or two more questions that you think might be pertinent. We're just coming up on the hour there, and I see a few people dropping off, but we might finish up with one or two questions.
I'd love to continue. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jill. I'll go ahead and take one. So we had a question that, if a project has a deadline and requirements before it starts, would you push this towards waterfall rather than an agile route? I think this is a great question, especially in the context of what we're talking about today. And I think, it's not a black and white answer, but I think it definitely depends on the context. I would absolutely consider it. I think the way that I think about when I think about projects, when I'm looking at them and think about what their right approach is to be, I look at them essentially across two dimensions. I look at the domain risk, which is often like, how likely is this to change? How much do we know about the business? And in this example, where we say, hey, the deadline and requirements have already been set, if we are 100% confident that these requirements are not going to change, because we've done this type of project 100 times before, and we know it doesn't really change that much, and we know this is the things we need to accomplish to be successful, so there's just simply not a lot of unknown in this, then I would say this project has a very, very low domain risk. The other thing I would look at, though, is what is the implementation risk? Is like, this comes back to like the actual getting to market, the technology platform, things like that we're looking at. Like, so when I look at how well do we know this tech? Is this a tech we've built 100 projects in before? Is this something new? Is this a distribution channel we're very familiar with? Are we shipping out to the app store and it's the 15th app that we've done in the last 2 years, so we're very, very familiar with that strategy? Or is this the first time we've ever done a mobile app and we don't even know what this looks like? Is this the first time we've ever done an Android app? So how much unknown, how much risk is that in the actual implementation strategy, both around your deployment strategy, your distribution, your underlying technology, all of that. If you have a very low domain risk, but a very high, or comparatively high implementation risk because it's a new tech or it's a new deployment strategy, I would probably still look at Agile, at least, to really kind of understand, like, hey, there's unknown coming into this, and the best tool that we have to mitigate that unknown and mitigate that risk is Agile. So I would still look at that. However, if there's very low implementation risk, so it's a project where, hey, we've done this ton of projects 100 times before, we've used this technology 100 times before, before, so there's very low risk both in the domain and the implementation, I would seriously consider waterfall for that project, because as we mentioned, Agile can create more overhead depending on the framework. And I would start to look at that from the product perspective of, are we going to necessarily benefit from the additional overhead to do this project that we essentially have done 100 times before? Tommy, any thoughts?
No, yeah, well, I do have thoughts on it, but yeah, I agree. Yeah, no, you're definitely right. You should, and I especially like the part where you said, okay, maybe Agile is not the best approach in this particular case, right? That's definitely true. So I guess we can do the last one then. If there is a long procurement process at the beginning of an Agile project, would you see this fitting into the Agile team, or should it be separate? So I think the procurement process, if it's, sometimes you work in a government organization and you just have rules to follow, like procedures that need to be followed just from an auditing perspective. So there's no way around that, and there's no cutting it in pieces because of the approval process. Then I would do that in parallel. Now, if you can do it in parallel, usually if you're doing a technology acquisition, you will want to make sure that once that particular piece of technology is actually procured, that it fits in with the rest of the things that you're trying to do in an iterative way, in an agile way. So one of the things that I see working there is, if the agile team is creating, let's say they use Scrum and they're working from a backlog system, you really want to use the definition of ready as a quality check whether or not this fits with the thing that you're procuring in the long run. Because if you have a procurement project running parallel with the agile development, misalignment is one of the big risks, right? You start creating things in an agile way, then the new technology comes in and you have a lot of rework to do. So that's where I would use the definition of ready to really make sure that every piece of, or let's say every feature, every user story that you're creating actually fits within the new technology that is procured. So that's something that I would do in that situation. So yeah, in my opinion, yeah, I wouldn't let the agile team necessarily be part of the procurement process itself, although you might want to let them be part of the requirements creation process if that's needed. Yeah. Jeremy, any thoughts on that one? I think we've seen it a lot.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think that would definitely be the right way to approach it, is that, we definitely want the team to be aware of it. That this is a great example of like, hey, maybe this is a part of the process where Agile isn't necessarily the best fit, or this is a type of project where Agile may not necessarily be the best fit, at least this portion of it. But we would definitely want the team to be aware of it and want that to be, reflected in their own work. Because what we do want to understand is that there is a coupling between the procurement and the implementation. And to help people understand that, like, hey, whatever decisions that we make in the procurement stage affect us downstream in the implementation stage. So we just want to make sure that everyone is aware of that, and we're once again transparent and open about those, those connections throughout. So I love your idea of really kind of reflecting that with the definition of ready. I think that's a great way to really make that explicit of what those effects are downstream.
Right. I think Jill wants us to.
Okay. Yeah, well, I just want to say thank you very much to both of you. That was really, really interesting. And thank you to everybody who attended and for all of the questions that made it a really interactive session, which I think really made it. I'm sure the guys appreciated all the questions as well. Yeah, so thank you very much for everybody's time. And thank you, Jeremy, and thank you, Tommy.
Thank you. Our pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Tommy.
Okay,
thanks,
goodbye. And the recording will be shared with everybody after the event as well. So keep an eye out for that. So thank you.
Cool.
Bye-bye now.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.